number. He left me an address. I rose, in an apron. The champagne flutes were still sparkling on silver platters when my phone buzzed. 800 guests filled the cathedral, their whispers echoing off stained glass windows that had witnessed a century of vows. My fingers trembled as I read the message that would shatter everything I thought I knew about love, about family, about the carefully constructed life I was about to enter. Sorry. You deserve to be free more than this. The words from Caleb felt like ice water in my veins. No explanation, no phone call, no face-to-face conversation. Just 21 characters that reduced our 2-year engagement to digital debris. I stared at the screen, my $70,000 dress suddenly feeling like a straitjacket. The cathedral's pipe organ began the opening notes of Wagner's bridal chorus, and I could hear my father's footsteps approaching the bridal suite door. "Cassidy, sweetheart, it's time." His voice carried the weight of expectation, of business deals sealed with handshakes and marriages that merged empires rather than hearts. The door opened, and I watched his face transform from paternal pride to confusion, then to something approaching horror. The phone slipped from my hands, clattering against the marble floor as I finally understood what Caleb meant. Freedom. The word tasted foreign on my tongue, like a language I'd forgotten how to speak. "What's happened?" Dad's voice was sharp now, businesslike. Behind him, I could see my mother's pearls catching the light, her expression already calculating damage control. The Wyatt family didn't do scandal well. We did mergers, acquisitions, and strategic partnerships. We did not do abandoned brides. I couldn't speak. The words lodged in my throat like shards of glass. Instead, I lifted the phone, showing them the message that had just rewritten my entire future. My mother's gasp was audible even over the organ music that continued to play, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the bridal suite. "He can't do this," she whispered, but her eyes were already calculating. The press, the investors, the King family's reputation. Her voice trailed off as she realized the magnitude of what Caleb's text message meant for both our families. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror, seeing a stranger in white silk and Belgian lace. The woman staring back at me had spent 26 years being the perfect daughter, the perfect student, the perfect fiancée. She had never made a decision that wasn't approved by committee, never taken a step that wasn't choreographed by others, and suddenly, I knew what I had to do. I kicked off my Italian leather pumps and ran. Through the cathedral's side door, past the shocked wedding planner, beyond the white roses and baby's breath that had cost more than most people's cars. I ran until the sounds of confusion and damage control faded behind me, until all I could hear was my own heartbeat and the rustle of silk against my legs. The rain started as I reached the street, and I realized I had no phone, no wallet, no destination, just a wedding dress and a freedom I'd never asked for but somehow desperately needed. The city lights blurred through my tears as I stood there, finally alone for the first time in my adult life. That's when I remembered the address I'd carried in my wallet for 15 years but never had the courage to visit. The place my mother had fled from when I was 11, the small town she'd never explained leaving, the life she'd abandoned for reasons that were never discussed in our perfectly manicured household. Millbrook was 3 hours away by bus, and I arrived looking like a refugee from someone else's fairy tale. The wedding dress was stained with rain and road dust. The elaborate updo my hairstylist had spent 4 hours, perfecting now hung in damp tendrils around my face. I must have looked like a ghost as I walked down Main Street, following muscle memory to an address I'd only seen on old envelopes. The building stood at the corner of 5th and Elm, a 2-story brick structure with dark windows and a faded sign that read, "The Apron House." Paint peeled from the shutters, and weeds grew through cracks in the sidewalk, like nature's attempt to reclaim what had been abandoned. This had been my mother's restaurant, the place she'd owned and operated before she became Mrs. Richard Wyatt, before she traded aprons for pearls and homemade pies for charity luncheons. I found the key exactly where I remembered her saying it would be. All those years ago when she'd whispered stories of her life before. Under the third loose brick beside the back door, wrapped in oilcloth and waiting like a secret she'd never meant to share. The door opened with a creak that seemed to echo through decades of silence. Inside, dust motes danced in the afternoon light that filtered through grimy windows. The dining room still held its mismatched tables and chairs, though they wore thick coats of dust and neglect. Behind the counter, the old cash register sat like a monument to a life abandoned. Photographs on the walls showed smiling faces I didn't recognize, customers from another era when this place had been alive with conversation and the clatter of dishes. But it was the kitchen that took my breath away. The massive commercial stove, the wooden prep tables scarred by years of use, the hooks where aprons once hung of it exactly as my mother had described in her rare, unguarded moments. Copper pots hung from overhead racks, their surfaces green with tarnish but still noble in their neglect. And there, on the windowsill beside the herb garden that had long since died, was an envelope with my name written in her careful handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it, the paper crackling with age. "My dearest Cassidy," it began, "if you're reading this, it means I couldn't protect you from the path I once walked. 25 years ago, I stood where you're standing now, in a wedding dress I never wanted to wear, about to marry a man I was told to love." The words seemed to leap off the page, written in the same ink that had once filled my birthday cards and school permission slips. I sank into one of the dusty chairs, my ruined dress pooling around me like spilled milk. The letter continued, revealing a story I'd never heard, about a young woman named Lydia who'd owned this restaurant, who'd been engaged to marry Jonathan King Caleb's father-in, a union arranged by their families to merge two business empires. The parallels were so exact they felt choreographed, like history had been waiting 25 years to repeat itself. "I ran the night before the wedding," the letter revealed. "I burned my dress in the alley behind the restaurant and disappeared into the night. I thought I was free, but I was wrong. I was simply traded from one cage to another, from the Kings to the Wyatts. Your father was kinder, gentler, but the cage was still there." My mother's words blurred as tears mixed with rain and exhaustion. She'd run from an arranged marriage only to end up in another one, and now history was repeating itself with surgical precision. Caleb wasn't just my fiancé. He was the son of the man my mother had fled from. Our engagement wasn't about love, it was about finishing what the previous generation had started. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and leaving me hollow. All those romantic dinners, all those carefully planned dates, all the moments I'd thought were genuine attraction had been nothing more than elaborate theater. I spent that first night on the floor of the restaurant, wrapped in dusty tablecloths and haunted by the weight of inherited expectations. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant sound of traffic on Main Street. When morning came, I found myself in the kitchen, staring at the old recipe cards my mother had left behind. They were organized by season, by difficulty, by the stories she'd told me about each dish. Her handwriting filled the margins with notes. "Add extra vanilla on rainy days. Mrs. Henderson's favorite, perfect for broken hearts." I selected one at random, sweet milk pie for the heartbroken and the healing. The ingredients were simple: buttermilk, eggs, sugar, flour, and vanilla. But as I mixed the filling, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: purpose, choice. The simple act of creating something with my own hands, following my mother's instructions, felt like a form of prayer. The old oven took forever to heat, its ancient coils glowing orange in the dim kitchen, but when the pie finally emerged, golden and fragrant, it was like a small miracle had occurred in that abandoned space. I ate it sitting on the back steps, still wearing the remains of my wedding dress. It tasted like childhood memories I'd forgotten, like summer afternoons and unconditional love. It tasted like home. That's when I heard the footsteps. An elderly man approached cautiously, his eyes widening when he saw me. "Lord have mercy," he whispered. "You look just like Lydia did, sitting in that same spot 25 years ago." His name was Frank, and he'd been the mailman when my mother owned the restaurant. He was retired now, but he still walked these streets every morning out of habit. He told me about the day she'd disappeared, how she'd given him a freshly baked pie, and asked him to remember her kindly. She was scared, he said, accepting the slice of sweet milk pie I offered him with trembling hands. Scared of the wedding, scared of the life she was supposed to want. As Frank ate, tears rolled down his weathered cheeks. "This tastes exactly like hers," he said. "Like she's still here, still taking care of folks." He looked at me with eyes that had seen decades of small-town secrets. "She loved this place more than anything. except maybe you." She used to say this kitchen was where she felt most herself. Over the following days, more neighbors appeared, drawn by the smoke from the restaurant's chimney and the impossible rumor that Lydia's daughter had returned. They came hesitantly at first, peering through windows before working up the courage to knock. But once they started talking, the stories poured out like water from a broken dam. They came with stories about my mother I'd never heard. How she'd fed the homeless during the harsh winter of 1998. How she'd taught cooking classes to young mothers. How she'd turned the restaurant into a gathering place for anyone who needed community. Mrs. Patterson, now in her 80s, remembered how my mother had delivered soup to her door every day after her husband died. "She never made me feel like charity," she said, her voice thick with memory. "Just knocked, handed me the pot, and said, 'Thought you might enjoy this today.' Made me feel seen, you know. Like I mattered to someone." Tommy Rodriguez, now a grown man with children of his own, told me about the chicken soup that had nursed him through pneumonia as a child. "My mama worked 2 jobs, couldn't stay home with me. Lydia would bring soup and sit with me until my fever broke." Each story came with a request for a specific dish, and I found myself learning to cook not from cookbooks but from the collective memory of a town that had loved my mother. Every recipe was a story. Every dish a connection to the woman who'd given up this life to become the perfect wife and mother I'd known. But in the margins of her recipe cards, I found the real Lydia. Notes about failed experiments, jokes about difficult customers, dreams about expanding the restaurant or maybe writing a cookbook. These glimpses of her authentic self were treasures I'd never known existed. The woman who'd raised me had been polished, careful, always saying the right thing. But this Lydia was messy, creative, full of opinions and dreams that had been carefully edited out of the version I'd known. I found myself grieving not just for what I'd lost, but for what she'd given up to become the mother she thought I needed. I was learning to make her famous dinner rolls when Caleb appeared. He stood in the doorway like a ghost, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his designer suit wrinkled and rain-stained. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, and when he spoke, his voice was hoarse with exhaustion. "I couldn't do it," he said simply. "I couldn't trap you the way our parents were trapped." He moved into the kitchen slowly, like he was afraid I might bolt again. His eyes took in the flour-dusted surfaces, the recipe cards scattered across the counter, the apron I'd found in my mother's things and tied around my waist. "Did you know my father was engaged to your mother? That our whole relationship was just them trying to finish what they'd started?" I didn't trust my voice, so I just nodded, my hands continuing to knead the dough. The rhythm was soothing, meditative. Caleb watched me work, and I could see the questions forming in his eyes. He looked different here, smaller somehow, like the expensive suit and confident demeanor had been costumes he'd finally been allowed to remove. "I found the contracts," he continued, settling into one of the chairs at the prep table, "the merger documents, the prenup that was already drafted, the timeline for combining our companies. We weren't getting married, Cassidy. We were being absorbed." He laughed bitterly. "I thought I was saving you from a loveless marriage, but I was really saving us both from being business acquisitions. The truth hung between us like smoke." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw not the confident businessman I'd been engaged to, but a man who'd discovered he was as much a pawn as I was. "So what now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The dough beneath my hands was smooth and elastic, ready for its first rise. "Now we figure out who we really are," he said. "Away from them, away from their plans, away from everything we were told we should want." He gestured around the kitchen. "This place, what you're doing here's the first real thing I've seen in years." We worked together that afternoon, Caleb learning to roll dough while I told him about my mother's recipes, about the neighbors who'd shared their stories, about the strange peace I'd found in this abandoned kitchen. He was surprisingly good with his hands, patient with the finicky dinner rolls that required precise timing and gentle handling. "I never learned to cook," he admitted as we waited for the bread to rise. "My parents had staff for that. I barely know how to boil water." He looked around the kitchen with something approaching wonder. "But this feels important. Like making something that matters." But as the days passed, I realized that while Caleb and I had found our way to understanding and friendship, we could never be more than that. We'd been cast in roles that had nothing to do with who we really were, and while we'd found our way to mutual respect and affection, we'd never find our way to love. That was okay. We'd given each other something more valuable than romance, we'd given each other truth. He stayed for a week, helping me clean and repair, sharing stories about his own journey of discovery. He'd quit his job at his father's company, he told me, and was thinking about teaching. I always loved history, he said one evening as we painted the dining room walls. Maybe I can help kids understand that they don't have to repeat their parents' mistakes. When he left, it was with a hug that felt like forgiveness. We both knew we'd never be lovers, but we'd always be allies in the revolution against inherited expectations. He promised to keep our families from interfering with what I was building here, and I promised to send him pictures of the restaurant when it was finished. A month after arriving in Millbrook, I found Elias. Or rather, he found me. He appeared in the kitchen one morning, a man in his 50s with flour-dusted hands and eyes that crinkled when he smiled. "Your mother taught me to bake," he said simply. Heard her daughter was trying to bring this place back to life. His voice carried a slight accent, remnants of his childhood in Puerto Rico. Elias didn't ask questions about my failed wedding or my family's expectations. He simply rolled up his sleeves and began repairing the old brick oven that had been broken for years. "Your mama always said this oven was the heart of the place," he explained, his hands gentle as he worked. "Said it knew how to turn raw ingredients into something that could heal people." His presence was different from Caleb's nervous energy or the neighbor's careful sympathy. Elias worked with quiet confidence, like he belonged in this kitchen as much as I was learning to. We worked together in comfortable silence, and I found myself drawn to his steady competence. He wasn't trying to rescue me or fix me, was simply there, offering his skills and his presence without expecting anything in return. "You don't need love to survive," he said one evening as we cleaned flour from the work surfaces. "But if you're going to let someone walk beside you while you build your life, make sure they're willing to let you be the architect." His words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom, and I found myself storing them away like one of my mother's precious recipes. As the weeks turned into months, I began to understand what my mother had loved about this place. It wasn't just the cooking or the restaurant, it was the connections, the way food became a bridge between people, the satisfaction of nourishing others. Every meal was an act of care, every recipe a form of communication. The kitchen became my classroom, the neighbors, my teachers, and slowly, I learned not just to cook, but to listen. I decided to reopen the restaurant, not as a recreation of my mother's dream, but as something entirely my own. I spent weeks scrubbing years of neglect from every surface, repairing equipment that had been silent for decades, painting walls that had faded to the color of forgotten dreams. Elias worked beside me, teaching me the mysteries of yeast and gluten, showing me how to coax flavor from simple ingredients. His presence was steady, undemanding, like bedrock beneath shifting sand. We never talked about romance or the future, but there was an intimacy in the way we moved around each other in the kitchen, the way he anticipated what I needed before I asked. It was the kind of partnership built on shared purpose rather than passion, and it felt more solid than anything I'd ever experienced. The reopening was intimate, just the neighbors who'd shared their stories and helped me understand my mother's legacy. I wore one of her old aprons, faded blue cotton that smelled faintly of vanilla and home. The menu featured the dishes that had meant the most to the people who'd known her, prepared with ingredients from local farms and suppliers who remembered when the apron house had been the heart of the community. But my most important addition was the community tabla, long wooden surface where strangers could become friends over shared meals and honest conversation. I'd learned from my mother's letters that she'd always dreamed of this, a place where the act of eating together could heal the small wounds that accumulate in any community. The first night, 12 people sat around that table, sharing stories and passing platters like they'd known each other for years. Mrs. Patterson sat next to Tommy Rodriguez, comparing stories about my mother's cooking. Frank brought his son, a quiet man who worked at the hardware store and rarely spoke to anyone. But over plates of my mother's famous pot roast, he told us about his struggles with anxiety, how the noise of the world sometimes felt too loud. Sarah Chen, who ran the flower shop, shared her fears about her teenage daughter's college applications. The conversation flowed around the table like wine, intoxicating in its honesty. I watched from the kitchen doorway, tears streaming down my face as I realized what my mother had been trying to create all those years ago. Not just a restaurant, but a sanctuary. A place where people could lay down their masks and be seen for who they really were. The restaurant began to attract attention from food bloggers and travel writers, but I was careful to maintain its essential character. This wasn't about fame or profit, it was about continuation, about taking my mother's interrupted dream and allowing it to grow in new directions. Every morning, I'd put on her apron and feel connected to something larger than myself. I established rules that felt sacred. The community table was always available for anyone who needed it. We never turned away someone who was hungry but couldn't pay, and every dish was made with ingredients we could pronounce and defend. The kitchen became a place of apprenticeship, where local teenagers could learn skills that would serve them beyond these walls. 6 months after the wedding that never was, I organized my first confession kitchen event. The concept was simple. Anyone could come, share a meal, and tell a story they'd never told before. The only rule was honesty, no performance, no careful editing, just the messy truth of human experience. I'd been inspired by the conversations around the community table, the way food seemed to lower people's defenses and invite authentic connection. The response was overwhelming. People came from neighboring towns, drawn by the promise of authentic connection in a world that often felt increasingly artificial. They shared stories of loss and hope, of mistakes and redemption, of the small moments that had shaped their lives. I listened to each story while I cooked, weaving their words into the rhythm of chopping and stirring. A woman named Maria told us about losing her son in Afghanistan, how she'd learned to bake his favorite cookies as a way of keeping his memory alive. "Every batch is a prayer," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "Every cookie is a way of saying his name." A man named David shared his struggle with alcoholism, how cooking had become his meditation, his path back to himself. In the kitchen, "I'm not a drunk," he said. "I'm just a man making dinner for people he cares about." Each confession was met with acceptance, with understanding, with the simple gift of being heard. I realized that this was what my mother had been trying to create all those years, not just a restaurant, but a sanctuary, a place where people could lay down their masks and be seen for who they really were. The confessions became a monthly tradition, and people began planning their visits around them. Local therapists started referring clients to the confession nights, recognizing something in the process that traditional therapy couldn't replicate. There was something about the combination of good food and honest storytelling that created a unique form of healing. I found myself becoming not just a cook, but a keeper of stories, a guardian of secrets that people trusted me to hold. The final event I organized was called Burning Letters. I invited anyone who had words they needed to release the old love letters, rejection notices, promises that had been broken. We'd gather in the restaurant's back garden, where I'd resurrected my mother's herb garden and built a fire pit among the rosemary and thyme. People could share their stories if they wanted to, or keep them private, then burn the letters that had held them captive. I brought my mother's final letter, the one I'd found that first day. In it, she'd written about her regrets, her fears, her hope that I would find the courage she'd never had. "I was afraid to disappoint them," she'd written. "I was afraid to be alone. I was afraid to fail, but I was most afraid of succeeding at something that was entirely my own." The letter had become both a comfort and a burden, a reminder of dreams deferred and possibilities lost. As the flames consumed the paper, I watched 25 years of her regret transform into ash and smoke. Around me, others fed their own disappointments to the fire. Divorce papers, medical bills, letters from children who no longer spoke to their parents. Each piece of paper carried its own weight of sorrow, and watching them burn felt like a collective exhale, a community-wide release of the past. As I watched the letter burn, I felt something shift inside me. The grief I'd carried for my mother's lost dreams, the anger about my manipulated engagement, the fear of an uncertain future, all of it transformed into something else. Not happiness, exactly, but a deep sense of rightness, of being exactly where I belonged. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks into the star-filled sky like prayers being answered. Standing in the garden, wearing my mother's apron, surrounded by friends who'd become family, I finally understood what freedom meant. It wasn't the absence of connections or responsibilities, it was the power to choose them consciously, to build a life based on your own values rather than inherited expectations. Elias stood beside me, not as my savior or my other half, but as a partner in the truest sense, someone who'd chosen to walk the same path. 1 year after the wedding that never was, I stood in my kitchen early in the morning, preparing for another day of feeding people and listening to their stories. The apron was soft against my skin, familiar now in a way that wedding dress had never been. I thought about the woman who'd run from that cathedral, desperate and directionless, and marveled at the journey that had brought me here. The morning routine had become sacred. Lighting the ovens, checking the sourdough starter, reviewing the day's menu with Elias. We'd hired 2 part-time servers, local women who understood the restaurant's mission and protected it fiercely. The community table was booked solid for weeks, and we'd started a waiting list for the confession nights. But somehow, we'd managed to maintain the intimate feeling that made the Apron House special. I was no longer someone who waited for permission to live. I was someone who chose her own ingredients, who trusted her own judgment, who knew that the best recipes were the ones you created yourself. I'd learned that freedom wasn't something you were given, it was something you took. One choice at a time, one day at a time, one meal at a time. As the sun rose over Main Street, painting the restaurant's windows gold, I tied my apron strings and smiled. Today, like every day, I would feed people and listen to their stories. I would honor my mother's legacy while building something entirely my own. I would be exactly who I was meant to be, not the perfect daughter, not the abandoned bride, but the woman who'd learned to rise from the ashes of someone else's dreams. The kitchen hummed with possibility, and I was ready to begin again. Outside, I could hear the town waking up, the first customers of the day approaching. Elias appeared in the doorway, flour already dusting his hands, ready for another day of creating something beautiful together. The community table sat empty but waiting, ready to welcome whoever needed a place to belong. I had everything I needed, my mother's recipes, my own courage, and the knowledge that sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is having your carefully planned life fall apart. Because only then can you discover who you really are when no one else is writing your story. The morning light streamed through the windows, illuminating the prayer I'd written on a card and pinned above the stove. May all who enter here leave nourished in body and spirit. The restaurant had become more than I'd ever imagined when I first stumbled through that door in a ruined wedding dress. It was a place of transformation, where people came broken and left whole, where stories were shared and burdens lightened. Every dish that left the kitchen carried with it a piece of my heart, a prayer for the person who would receive it. And as I began to cook, not because I had to, but because I chose to, I knew that this was what my mother had always wanted for me. Not the perfect marriage or the pristine reputation, but the messy, beautiful, completely authentic life that could only be built one choice at a time. The morning stretched ahead of me, full of possibility and purpose, and I couldn't wait to see what stories would unfold around the community table. That made all the difference.